The winter of 1897 had been the harshest anyone could remember in the Dakota Territory. Snow fell in thick, relentless curtains for weeks, and the ground froze so deep that even the strongest men struggled to break through with pickaxe and shovel. It was during this bitter season that Thomas Whitman found himself facing the most difficult job of his 43 years. Thomas had been a farmer all his adult life, working the same patch of stubborn prairie land his father had claimed decades earlier. The soil was good when the rains came, but the rains hadn't come often enough in recent years. His wife Martha had passed the previous spring, leaving him alone with debts that seemed to multiply like weeds in an untended garden. The bank had already taken most of his livestock, and the farm itself would likely follow before the next harvest season arrived. So when Doc Henderson approached him that grey February morning with an unusual proposition, Thomas found himself listening despite the uncomfortable knot forming in his stomach. "I know this ain't the kind of work you're accustomed to, Thomas," the old doctor said, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as they stood in the mercantile store. "But I'm in a difficult situation, and you're one of the few men I trust with something this delicate." Thomas shifted his weight from one worn boot to the other, waiting for the doctor to continue. "There's a young woman came through town yesterday with a traveling family. They found her collapsed on the road about 10 miles south of here. By the time they brought her to me, she was..." Doc Henderson paused, choosing his words carefully. "Well, she appeared to have passed on. No pulse I could detect, no breath I could see. Cold as winter itself." The doctor removed his hat and ran his fingers through his thinning grey hair. "The family couldn't stay. They had their own troubles and a long journey ahead. They left some coins for her burial, but the ground's too frozen for the regular gravedigger to manage. His arthritis has him laid up something fierce." Thomas understood now why he'd been approached. His years of farming had given him strong shoulders and hands that knew how to work with difficult earth, but something about the situation didn't sit right with him. "Doc," he said slowly, "if she's been gone since yesterday, why not wait for the ground to soften some come spring?" Doc Henderson looked uncomfortable. "Well, that's just it, Thomas. Something doesn't feel right about the whole situation. The family that brought her seemed nervous, eager to be on their way. And the girl, she doesn't look like someone who died of natural causes. No signs of illness or injury that I can see. Just still." Thomas studied the doctor's weathered face. Doc Henderson had delivered half the babies in the county and tended the sick and dying for more than 20 years. If something felt wrong to him, it probably was. "I'll need the job," Thomas admitted quietly. "The pay would help, and I reckon I can manage the digging better than most in this weather." "I thought you might," Doc Henderson said with obvious relief. "But Thomas, if anything seems unusual, anything at all, you come find me right away. Promise me that." Thomas nodded his agreement, though he wasn't entirely sure what could be unusual about a burial that wasn't already strange to begin with. The doctor led him to a small room behind his office, where the young woman lay on a simple wooden table, covered with a clean white sheet. When Doc Henderson pulled back the cloth, Thomas drew in a sharp breath. She was beautiful in the way that made a man think of poetry he'd never learned to write. Golden hair spread across the pillow like spun wheat, and her face held a peaceful expression that seemed almost too serene for someone who had supposedly died on a cold winter road. Her skin, though pale, had a quality to it that Thomas couldn't quite name. She looked more like someone in the deepest sleep than someone who had passed from this world. "How old would you say she is?" Thomas asked quietly. "Hard to tell for certain, maybe 25, maybe 30. No identification, no belongings, except the clothes she was wearing." Doc Henderson covered her again with the sheet. "The family said they didn't know her name." Thomas spent the rest of that morning preparing for the burial. He selected a peaceful spot in the small cemetery just outside town, beneath an old oak tree that would provide shade when the warm months returned. The ground was indeed frozen solid, But Thomas had learned patience from years of coaxing life. From stubborn soil, he built a small fire nearby and worked slowly, letting the heat soften the earth inch by inch. By late afternoon, he had managed to dig down about 2 feet. It was slow, difficult work, and his hands were numb despite his thick gloves. The snow continued to fall in lazy flakes, and the short winter day was already beginning to fade into evening. Thomas returned to Doc Henderson's office to collect the young woman. Together, they wrapped her carefully in a simple pine coffin that the doctor had purchased from the local carpenter. As they carried her through the quiet streets, Thomas found himself thinking about his Martha, about how different this burial felt from that terrible day when he'd laid his wife to rest. At the gravesite, Thomas lowered the coffin gently into the partially dug grave. It would have to do for now. He could finish the digging in the morning and complete the burial properly. But something made him hesitate before shoveling the first load of earth. Perhaps it was the way the lamplight flickered across the coffin lid, or maybe it was just the strange feeling he'd carried all day that something wasn't right. Whatever the reason, Thomas found himself kneeling beside the grave and carefully opening the coffin one last time. The young woman lay exactly as they had placed her, hands folded peacefully across her chest. But as Thomas looked closer, something made him catch his breath. Was it his imagination, or did her skin seem to have more color than it had that morning? He leaned closer, and that's when he saw it. The slightest movement beneath her eyelids, as if she were dreaming. Thomas stared in amazement, hardly daring to breathe. Then as he watched, her eyes slowly opened. They were the most beautiful blue eyes he had ever seen, and they looked directly at him with a mixture of confusion and gratitude that made his heart skip several beats. "Where?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the cold air. "Where am I?" Thomas sat back on his heels, his mind racing. "You're safe," he said gently, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. "You're in Millbrook. Do you remember what happened to you?" She tried to sit up, and Thomas quickly helped her, wrapping his heavy coat around her shoulders. She was shivering now, which seemed like a good sign. "I remember falling," she said slowly. "The cold. Someone saying I was... But that's not possible, is it?" She looked around at the cemetery, at the open grave, and understanding dawned in her eyes. "Oh my goodness, were you about to bury you?" Thomas finished quietly. "Yes, ma'am, though I have to say, I'm mighty glad you decided to wake up first." Despite everything, she smiled at that. It was a smile that seemed to warm the cold winter air around them. "I'm Elizabeth," she said. "Elizabeth Carson. I don't suppose you know how I ended up here?" Thomas helped her to her feet, noting that she seemed steady enough, though still confused. "A traveling family brought you to our doctor yesterday. They said they found you on the road. Everyone thought you had..." He paused, unsure how to finish that sentence delicately. "Died," Elizabeth said simply. "I remember feeling so cold, so tired. I must have fallen asleep in the snow." She looked at Thomas with eyes full of wonder. "You saved my life. If you had buried me without looking..." The thought sent a chill through Thomas that had nothing to do with the winter weather. "Don't think about that," he said firmly. "What matters is you're alive and safe." They walked slowly back toward town, Thomas carrying his lantern, and Elizabeth wrapped in his coat. Along the way, she told him what she could remember. She had been traveling alone to meet a distant relative in the next territory when her horse had thrown her during a sudden blizzard. She must have wandered in the snow for hours before collapsing. "I have nowhere to go now," she admitted as they reached the outskirts of Millbrook. "No horse, no supplies, and my relative is probably wondering what became of me." Thomas found himself making an offer before he'd fully thought it through. "You could stay at my place until you get your strength back and figure out your next steps. It's not much, but it's warm, and I could use the company." Elizabeth stopped walking and looked at him with surprise. "You don't even know me. For all you know, I could be..." "A decent person who's had some bad luck," Thomas interrupted. Gently, same as most of us, I reckon. Over the following days, Elizabeth proved to be exactly that. She was intelligent, kind, and had a way of bringing light into Thomas's quiet farmhouse that he hadn't experienced since Martha's passing. She insisted on helping with cooking and cleaning despite his protests, and in the evenings they would sit by the fire and share stories of their lives. Elizabeth had been a teacher before deciding to head west. She loved books and learning, and had a gift for explaining complex ideas in simple terms. Thomas found himself telling her things he hadn't shared with anyone, about his struggles with the farm, his loneliness since Martha's death, and his fears, about losing everything he'd worked for. "You know," Elizabeth said one evening as they watched the snow fall outside the kitchen window, "I've been thinking about what happened, about how I ended up in that grave." Thomas looked up from his coffee. "What about it? I think maybe it was meant to happen exactly the way it did. Not the almost dying part, but finding my way here, to you." She smiled, that warming smile of hers. "I believe sometimes the worst moments in our lives are actually doorways to the best ones." As winter slowly gave way to spring, Thomas and Elizabeth discovered they had found something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed. She helped him develop new approaches to farming that made better use of his land. He provided her with the stability and partnership she had always hoped to find. On a warm April morning, as they worked together in the garden behind his farmhouse, Thomas looked up to see Elizabeth laughing at something one of his chickens was doing. The sight filled him with a contentment he thought he'd lost forever. "Elizabeth," he said, setting down his hoe, "I have something to ask you." She turned to him with dirt on her hands and joy in her eyes. "What is it, Thomas? Would you consider staying here permanently? Not as someone I'm helping out, but as my wife." Elizabeth's smile was brighter than the spring sunshine. "Thomas Whitman," she said, "I thought you'd never ask." They were married that June in the little church where Thomas had once said goodbye to Martha. The same cemetery where he'd almost buried Elizabeth now held flowers they'd planted together, and the oak tree provided shade for their wedding reception. Years later, when people would ask Thomas about the day he met his wife, he would always pause and get that thoughtful look in his eyes. "I was hired to bury her," he would say, watching Elizabeth tend their children in the garden they'd planted together. "But she had other plans entirely. Best thing that ever happened to me was taking a job I never wanted to do." And Elizabeth would smile and add, "Sometimes life has to stop completely before it can begin again in ways we never imagined." Their farmhouse became known throughout the county as a place where travelers could find a warm meal and a safe place to rest. Thomas and Elizabeth never turned anyone away, perhaps because they both remembered what it felt like to need the kindness of strangers. The farm prospered under their joint care, and they raised 4 children who grew up understanding that the most important things in life often come disguised as the most frightening moments. And on quiet winter evenings, when the snow fell thick and peaceful outside their windows, Thomas and Elizabeth would sit by the fire and marvel at the mysterious ways that love finds us when we're brave enough to keep our hearts open, even in the darkest times.